This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. All right, welcome back, everyone. Another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today is going to be a much more lighthearted episode because I've had some pretty heavy ones lately, and the full swing of summer has arrived here in Alaska. As I record, it is June 10th, 2024, and man, when summer finally arrives in Alaska, it's pretty nice, like a real breath of fresh air. And I was able to start my summer by flying for Kako Retreat Center, and I thought I would do an episode about flying for Kako Retreat Center. Having just gotten back, it's fresh in my mind. I did have a week of family visiting after I returned from Kako, so I got about a week distance. But I think I'd like to talk about what I did with my family too, because we did some pretty neat stuff as well. But to jump right in, if you don't know anything about Kako Retreat Center, it is an old gold mine out at the Yukon Delta area in southwestern Alaska. If you're flying a plane and you come from Bethel, it's about a 1 hour flight straight north of Bethel. It's on the Yukon River, and it's very, very close to Russian Mission, a small Alaskan village. In fact, we use Russian Mission quite a bit as sort of a place to go. That's where the camp gets their mail, and you can go there for some supplies if you need. So Kako Retreat Center, I want to just describe what it is first, because I don't know if I've talked about it at all. I think maybe I did one last year. I don't remember. But straight from kakoretreatcenter.org, it says here, and I know this, but it just puts it much better on the website than I could say it. So it says, Kako Retreat Center is a nonprofit Christian organization providing Christ-centered retreats, youth camps, workshops, seminars, and counseling to encourage and benefit people living in remote Alaskan villages of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region. Kako is located by the Yukon River 400 miles west of Anchorage and the nearest road system. Approximately 30,000 Yupik, 1,000 Athabaskan, and 4,000 non-native people live in the YK Delta area. Kako is strategically centered with 24 villages within a half-hour flight and 56 villages within an hour flight from Kako's airstrip. Small planes are the only efficient means of transportation. And I was able to provide one of those small planes with my Piper Cherokee 6 300 horsepower airplane, was able to get into the Kako airstrip. Now, the airstrip itself is it's plenty long, but the real challenge to the airstrip is that it's banana shaped, so it's got a pretty sharp curve to it. And it's also in a valley and bumped up against a mountain. And so your abort point is pretty far back. You're committed to land pretty far back, which makes it just a little more dangerous going into Kako. But to land there, you kind of you come in with extra power and a little bit lower because there's swirling winds in there, and that gets you through with good positive control. And then you get below the tree line and you basically fly the plane around the curve of the airstrip, and then you set her down. And that's the kind of the artistic sort of thing that you have to do to get into Kako successfully. And I've done it enough times now to where it's kind of like muscle memory. But it is nonetheless a challenging airstrip. And it's a one-way strip. You cannot take off the other way. It is possible to land the other way. We call it a downhill landing, but I do not do it in my Cherokee. If I had my Maule out there, or a Cessna I know a Cessna can do it because it does do it sometimes, but doing the landing the other way is pretty rare. So anyway, I don't do it with my Cherokee. I only land the one way. So that's Kako. There's more history about Kako here that's super interesting. And I'm just going to read this straight from the website just to draw a picture of what Kako Retreat Center is and its history in Alaska. Just straight from the website, it says the vision for Kako originated in the mind of Ed Hooley, a Christian school teacher in the Yukon Delta. And I know that the main building at Kako is called Hooley Lodge, named after this man. Dave, which is Dave Pence, who's the founder of Kako, says Dave first met Eddie in 1963. He had his own airplane and often flew around helping missionaries each summer and on weekends. Dave started a kids' camp at Inowak in 1968, and Eddie was one of his helpers. As a ham operator, he talked nightly with Dave, sharing the need for his students to attend a camp like Inowak. While in Russian mission as a school teacher, he would come to Kako to bring supplies and saw the potential for a kids' camp. In 1976, Dave met with Eddie and his wife, Joyce, and made plans to do some work at Kako in order to prepare for a week of kids' camps the following summer. However, on February 20th, 1977, en route to Anchorage, their plane iced up and they were both killed in a crash. After much prayer and counsel, Dave and his wife, Janet, determined in their hearts to carry on Eddie's vision. As a missionary with Interact, it's an organization that's still going today. As a missionary with Interact for 18 years, Dave ministered with his family in these villages and had a heart for these people. From his experience, he saw the need to reach not only the kids, but the parents in support of them building strong families. He resigned from Interact Ministries in order to fulfill this vision and create a safe place for local families to come for seminars, counseling, and encouragement. They could ask questions in a homey, relaxed atmosphere and find answers from God's Word. A kids' camp was also in the plans. The Penns family moved to Kako in 1979 and pioneered the groundwork. Sadly, Dave's wife Jan passed away in 1986, and in 1988, Dave married Vera Kelly Johnson, and together they continued with the preparations needed to establish the mission. Kako Retreat Center became a reality in 1988 as a nonprofit, faith-based organization incorporated by the state of Alaska. So that's kind of the history of Kako Retreat Center and where it came from, and it's quite interesting. And I noticed here when it talked about wanting to provide a place for Native families, or just families from the villages. They're not all Native, but most of them are. Families from the villages to have a safe place to go. And literally in this last time I was there, that is how they describe it. I ask them, why do you come to Kako? I come to Kako because it's like a retreat. It's like a sanctuary. No one's drinking there. There's no violence going on. It's just like a safe place where I can just be and walk around and listen to God's word. And I just feel safe and at peace here. And so that vision for providing a place like that is what family camp at Kako is all about. And it's really a sweet testimony from the Native people I fly in there that they very consistently report that Kako feels like a safe place for them to come. And in fact, this last time I was there for family camp, they had a record number of people there. They've never had that many people there. In fact, there were so many people there that signed up. It kept our airplanes very, very busy. And they ran out of beds, so there wasn't enough beds for everyone to sleep in. So people were fine with sleeping on the floor. They set up a couple of tents. And they even had some people, we would fly to nearby Russian mission or fly to Marshall, which is also close. And we would pick people up in the morning, and then we would fly them home at night because there was no beds for them at the camp. And so they were able to come that way. So it was myself and 3 other pilots. And between us, we flew in quite a large number of people. Myself personally, I flew 28 hours and 2,335 miles. I flew 79 passengers and 42 landings. That's landings at Kako and including all the villages that I went to. There were 18 different villages represented while we were there. And that's kind of the data. We keep data of our flights of that time for family camp. One of the interesting little pieces of data is it's the it's a brother-in-law of the Pence family. His name is John. He's kind of a numbers guy, he always said. And he kind of did a flight schedule for us, and he was just a huge asset while we were there, doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. And he tracked how far all of the pilots combined flew. And I think it was something like 15 or 16,000 miles total. And we covered an area the size of the state of Missouri as far as distances flown. And so if you can make a concept of how big Alaska is, just for the Yukon Delta area, we covered an area the size of the state of Missouri just for this one event at Kako Retreat Center. So, and man, some of these flights were so long and so far. I would just fly for an hour and a half and not see a single cabin, not see a single thing, nothing but just tundra. And out in the Yukon Delta area, it's like this very, very low land. You know, the elevation of these airstrips go would be like 15 feet. You know, they're barely above sea level. And I would fly for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and not see a single thing, nothing but tundra and lakes to the more remote ones. So yes, a huge, huge area and very, very remote places that these people came in from. Now, this year at family camp, something that I really enjoyed was the live music. They brought this band in. It was the same band as from last year, and it's this group of Native men that call themselves Band of Brothers, and they're believers from different villages. A couple of them were from Tuksuk Bay, and a few others were from Chivak. And these villages are pretty far apart from each other, but these men have coordinated together, and they all arrived at Kako, and they played for the music for the weekend. And they were just, their hearts, their capability, their skill. It was just lovely to sit and watch. And they would, they might do a song like How Great Thou Art, and they'll sing it in English, but then they'll switch to Yupik. And to listen to the music in Yupik was just a real sweet experience. And I had a chance to sit down with the band a few times throughout the event and just sit and chat with them, and just quality men who really love Jesus and just want to worship him, and they're talented musicians, and just very easy and pleasant to be around. And we had great discussions just about the differences between the outside culture in Alaska, me basically, and the native culture in Alaska, and the differences that are there, and the misunderstandings, and just the grace and that they presented to me into those discussions was really sweet. The speaker was someone that the camp director brought in from Arizona. He was a Navajo man, and he had just graduated from a seminary. And he was so interesting because he just having come from seminary, a native Navajo man, and in seminary they taught him to be very academic about his preaching. So it was all about exegesis, all about interpreting the text properly, good hermeneutics. So very sort of academic approach. When he arrived, he got some advice that maybe you shouldn't be so academic. Native people don't really think that way. Be more story-based, and a few other bits of advice like that. And he was really challenged by this. I had a good conversation with him before his first talk, and I could tell he was torn up about it because he came with these talks prepared, good exegesis and hermeneutics, all good things. But that style of preaching, maybe not the best style for this audience. And so it needed to be more story-based from scripture. And so he was sitting there, he threw away his prepared talks, and he was trying to write new ones. And he was really quite stressed out about it. And he felt tension because he had just learned how to do a certain style of preaching that was academic. And now he's trying to go back to storytelling. And he himself had like this journey over the event of leaning into his sort of native way of thinking rather than an academic way of thinking. And he, at the end of the weekend, he said how freeing it was, not necessarily to get away from intellectual things or academic things, because those are very good and enriching, but the freedom to think like a native man, to be more orally based or story based. And he expressed that that was very freeing for him, to read scripture from a narrative perspective rather than an academic one. And I thought that was kind of an interesting progression to watch him go through that and talking with him throughout the weekend about it. So, as far as the flying part goes, which was my role at the camp, we started in Big Lake, Alaska, and my family climbed into our Cherokee 6, and we actually flew to Port Allsworth first. We went through Lake Clark Pass. The weather was nice and clear. It was a little bit bumpy in the pass, but we landed at Port Allsworth, and I had never been there before. I had heard quite a bit about Port Allsworth. Someone there told me that Port Allsworth is sometimes called the Jerusalem of Alaska because the entire community there is like most of them are believers. They're Christians. And you go there and there's something very light about the place. There's a Bible camp there called Tanalian Bible Camp. I think sometimes it's called Tanalian Leadership Center, depending on what time of year it is, I think. But that place is quite interesting, and I've heard a lot about it, and I learned a lot more while I was there. And I went there not just for a quick stop, but actually for a conference called Northern Ministry Training. And the camp there and the staff had prepared speakers and some sessions on ministry in Alaska, the unique challenges of ministry in Alaska, the challenges in the being an isolated missionary in a remote village, or what kind of psychological things might happen with someone on the mission field. So they went through some of that. What are some unique things about Native culture and related to missions? They had some people who grew up in Native people who grew up in the Native villages share their thoughts about it. What is it like to have these outsiders come in and tell us about the gospel? What's that like? And so it's very, very insightful, this Northern Ministry training. There were quite a few mission organizations represented there, and I was there to learn. And I really appreciated the staff there. Clearly had just really their hearts in the right place, and high quality people, and people who've been deeply I was going to say wounded, but I want to say they've been through truly difficult things that has strengthened them in a beautiful way. Your greatest strengths come through walking through your greatest weaknesses, and these are people who have walked through those. And so the staff there are just top notch. Their hearts were really amazing, and there was a real lightheartedness about being there. Not only is it stunningly beautiful with Lake Clark there and the turquoise blue color surrounded by mountains, but the community has a real sweetness. There's 2 air charters there and 2 airstrips, 1 air charter on each airstrip. There's Lake and Penn Air, and then there's Lake Clark Air. And I don't know much about them, but from what I was told, they're both very good air charters, and we have a real sweet community there. And really interestingly, the history of Port Allsworth, I don't fully know very well yet, but it was back in the day, a couple whose last name was Allsworth arrived there, and they were, through the Homestead Act in Alaska, they were able to get this several hundred acres of land. And later, that area became Lake Clark State Park. I think it's a state park. I'm not so clear on that. But because they had this land from the Homestead Act, the whole area is surrounded by state park, which means for who knows how long, they're not going to have any neighbors. And I'm not sure the details of how it works, but people are able to buy land on there and build homes. And it turned into this little community. I think the population is about 180 people or so. And on this plot, there's the 2 airstrips, the 2 air charters, there's the Bible camp, but then there's also Samaritan's Purse, which is Franklin Graham's organization. And they have, I think it's called OHOP, which I forget what it stands for, but it has to do with giving war veterans, people who are in Afghanistan, Iraq, to offer them a place, a retreat where they can receive counseling and refreshment. So it's one of Samaritans Purse's ministries, and that was there. And while we were there, I saw a Kodiak on floats come in and land, and I think there was a caravan that came in and landed and was dropping off employees, and they were getting things ready for their program to start up. So that was pretty neat to see. And apparently Samaritan's Purse has been very instrumental throughout Alaska. I know they paid for a lot of the facilities at Cochrane Hills Bible Camp, for example, or various facilities in villages throughout the state. I know that they were very generous with the ministry called MARC in Soldotna. With airplanes and help and financial help. They're heavily resourced, and they use those resources very well. So that's been my impression of Samaritan's Purse, and there they were at Port Allsworth. So pretty neat to connect with all of those folks and go to the Northern Ministry training. So anyway, we spent like 3, 4, 5 days there, and then we took off for Kako Retreat Center. Now, going to Kako Retreat Center, I hadn't been there for a year. I have not landed there for a year, and it's a challenging airstrip. So what I like to do is, with my family and the plane with me, I like to land at Russian Mission, which is a nice, long, easy airstrip. So I'll land there, and I'll have one of the Kako pilots who's all tuned up to fly into Kako. They'll land in Russian Mission and pick up my family, and they fly my family in. And so I do that just to make sure my family's as safe as possible. And then I will fly the Cherokee into Kako by myself. So I just feel a lot better about that. And but by myself, I'll leave Russian Mission and hop over to Kako, and I'll do a couple of low passes just to get a good look at the runway, and I run through my mind the process of landing there, and then I come around and I actually land. And all of that went very, very smoothly. The muscle memory from landing there a year ago came back really quickly. But, safety first, especially when it comes to my family. And that's how I did that. So now once we got settled and we went to bed and got up the next day and we were ready to fly. And the flying starts relatively early. And, the weather is always the question mark at Kako. And I remember the first day we were scheduled to fly, the forecast was like low IFR all around the area, the entire Yukon Delta area. The TAFs were all reading low IFR all day long. And so we were looking at each other, wondering if the flying was even going to happen. I was even saying, I don't think flying's going to happen at all. Like if the weather's not, within our personal minimums, we're just not going, period. We're just not going to compromise that. So I was like, well, we're probably not going to fly tomorrow, so we're going to lay low, and I guess the event will just be delayed a day. But then as we woke up, the forecast was wrong. And it was like not ideal weather, but it was above our minimums. And so we were able to start flying people in. And the thing about with weather, you might imagine that a nice, clear, sunny day is ideal, but it's actually not. Ideal weather is high overcast. Because when there's high overcast, you don't have that sun coming down and stirring up the wind and creating thermals. And if you have a clear, sunny day, it's probably going to be a bumpy ride. If you have high overcast, you'll more likely have calmer winds and smoother air. And so the day, actually, it didn't have high overcast, but it was high enough overcast, I should say, and within our minimums. And so it actually turned out to be nice, smooth, easy to fly in air. And it was quite pleasant flying to all of these villages. I remember specifically flying into Mountain Village. There was a pretty stiff crosswind, but it was nothing that made me nervous. But that was about it. There was a little bit of rain here and there, but nothing too heavy that we couldn't fly through, just kind of sprinkles. And so that was pretty nice. That the low IFR forecast turned out to be the nicest flying day because the very next day it was like clear blue skies and the forecast was looking great. And we were like thinking, oh, good, it's going to be nice and clear for the next day of flying. And the next day of flying came and it was fine in the morning, but in the afternoon, the winds just picked up. And I remember the last landings coming into Kako, having to be very aggressive on the power to get in there to get the plane to do what I wanted it to do. And we were able to handle it. But after doing that a few times, me and the other pilots kind of discussed it and we decided, we can handle this, but let's not push it anymore. Let's call it for the day. And so we did that. And so it's funny how the bad forecast turned into the nicest flying, and then the good forecast turned into the most challenging with the winds. But that's kind of how it is in Alaska. Is we always kind of look at the forecast with some skepticism because it usually turns out to be a little different than predicted. Now, a notable thing that happened on one of my flights was I was taken off empty to go pick up some folks for camp. I don't remember. I might have been going to Luksak. We went there a lot. I don't remember. Maybe Kwethluk. I don't remember where I was going, but I took off, and shortly after takeoff, my engine monitor failed. Now, an engine monitor is just a device with a digital screen on my panel, and it tells me what's going on in my engine. So my cylinder head temperatures, my exhaust gas temperatures, outside air temperature, oil pressure, oil temperature, and a handful of other parameters. And so it's a really great device to really baby your engine, to really take care of it well. But also on there was my manifold pressure and my RPM. And these are very critical things I need to see for flying. And they're called primary instruments. They're required instruments for a safe flight. And so if they fail, you'd have to turn around. And so I took off and I didn't have anyone with me, but that engine monitor failed. So the screen, it didn't turn off, but everything turned red and it said error. And I turned it off and turned it back on and it still didn't work. I kind of reached my hand behind the panel, jiggled some wires to see if that would do anything, and it did not come back alive. So I knew that I couldn't safely fly passengers like that. So I turned around and landed at Kako, and I let the other pilots and the flight planner know, and they had to work around the one down airplane. And so I spent some time diagnosing that, and I found a loose wire under the panel. And it's an older plane, and the wires, before I owned it, the previous owners would kind of not remove old wires that weren't used anymore. So it's just kind of a mess down there, and that makes it hard and frustrating. It's something I want to change, but so diagnosing it was challenging. Fortunately, I installed that engine monitor, and I knew where certain wires were, and I was pretty familiar with it. So I did find a loose wire. It was a simple ground wire, and I thought, oh, maybe that's it. So I put it back in and turned it on, and sure enough, the engine monitor turned back on and it came alive. So I thought, oh, great, I fixed it. So I told him, and I'm ready to fly. I fixed the engine monitor. So I took off for another village, and it failed again on my way to a village. And I'm like, oh man, I really thought I had it. And so I turned around, went back again, and I had to keep diagnosing. And what it turned out to be was a power wire to what I like to call the brain box. In this MVP 50 EI engine monitor, there's a device there. It's like this gold box called an EDC. And what the EDC does is it receives these signals from various sensors in the engine, and it converts them into a digital signal to send that to the screen, which gives me a display. And so that EDC box was not getting powered. And you can't tell that by the screen, but it does have a power wire that goes to it, which powers its functions. And so through some process of eliminations with my multimeter, I was able to determine that it was not getting power. And so I found the power line and I followed it, and it was all connected. but it didn't. I did a continuity test. It did not have continuity. So somewhere this wire must have been broken. And I followed that wire all the way from the power source to the EDC, and I did not see any breaks. And so it was like, what is going on here? And so I just kept at it. And eventually, at one certain splice, I kind of just grabbed it with my fingers and I jiggled it a little bit, and the splice just came apart. And so apparently there was a wire inside the splice that was just kind of bumping. And so it would turn on sometimes and not be on sometimes. And the wire in there would just kind of like make connection and disconnect. It was just kind of floating in there. And so that was it. I was able to cut that splice out and put in a new one. And the engine monitor worked perfectly for the rest of the time. But it was an interesting little lesson for me that these newer, more digital equipment we put in airplanes. A lot of times the issue is it's just these wires, and so it's very important to put in proper splices, to not use the cheap ones from Harbor Freight, but to use quality aviation grade splices. I think that's very important, especially for these critical systems in your plane that you rely on. So anyway, that was a very good reminder, even though the splice I had on there was an aviation one. I don't know why it failed, but it did. And now I know to double check those. Because when you lose your engine monitor, and I've flown that plane enough that I knew where the controls should be and how the engine should sound. So I have the proper manifold and RPM settings and mixture settings. Fortunately, I had enough experience in that plane to know what to do without seeing those numbers on my display. But, it's still, we rely on that quite a bit. So the wiring for these newer systems must be done well. It's pretty critical. Okay, so I'd like to comment just briefly about, how the weekend went, and just some really interesting behind the scenes stuff that I can't, this is not an appropriate platform to share everything. So I'm just going to say very general things. But just this idea that among the native culture here in Alaska, that even though there's a lot of like modernization to it, they all have iPhones, they're all on Facebook, they all speak perfect English, which was almost culture shock to me when I first got here, having come from Mexico, where nobody spoke English, or a lot of the Mexicans did, because they're very smart. But the Tarahumara people, the native people we lived with, none of them spoke English, and most of them, their first language was not even Spanish. So to come to Alaska, and I'm meeting with native people and they speak perfect English, I was like, okay, I need to get used to this. And that has to do with the history of Alaska. But even though they're very modernized in those ways, they are still native people. And what I'm trying to get at here is that the spiritual realm, spiritual warfare, this idea of spiritual spirits, demons, and specifically shamanism. There's good shamans and there's bad shamans, but they are still practicing in Alaska. And so I don't want to go into any detail on this platform, but those things are happening in the Yukon Delta area. And so when we got there, prayer became a very essential part of what we were doing there. So after we first landed and we kind of got our bags unpacked, me and one of the other pilots, we spent quite a long time praying into those things. And, I really think it made a massive difference. I had some just really good conversations with the camp director about those issues, and he really opened up about it. And then at the very end of camp, the camp director called all of the, everyone had flown home. Like, we've gotten all the campers. When I say campers, it's like these native families. We were able to fly them all home, and it was only the camp staff left. And the camp director called everyone in, and we had a meeting, and he was so encouraging, praising everyone for their hard work and acknowledging that it was, there was so much work to do, and it was complicated, and at various times people were frustrated with each other. I mean, that's just like normal ministry stuff. But he spent a lot of time encouraging them and acknowledging their hard work and singing their praises. It was such a sweet time. And there was some time just praying over the families that had been there. And so this extra focus on prayer with all the spiritual warfare things that were happening at the time, I really believe that made all the difference. I just finished writing a newsletter, and in it I talked about how in the Great Commission, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me. Now go and make disciples. And, in the end, he says, I will be with you to the end of the age. We go under his authority. It's all authority. And so the spiritual realm, the enemy, demonic stuff, it has authority. It's called the prince of this world. And there is power and authority there. And shamanism is a form of tapping into that. And some real consequences of that. But being it a spiritual battle, and I know maybe if you're listening, this is not something I grew up with too much, or it's not a topic I'm super familiar with, but Native people, like this is the ones in Mexico and here in Alaska, these are things that are very real to them and they live day in and day out with. And so for us to be able to pray with certain people and to, as camp staff, to pray against the enemy in these ways, we have never felt lighter at our time in Kako than this was. Other times we felt sort of a spiritual heaviness. I wish I could describe really well what that looks like or feels like. It's just there's something heavy, like almost a desire to leave. And when we do leave, it kind of lightens up when we kind of go, oh, it's nice to be out of there. It maybe kind of feels like that. But this time we didn't really want to leave. There was a lightness about it. And I really believe it's because of the prayer. And so I would say that was probably the most important aspect of this time at Kako. And I'm hopeful for going into the future for that to continue and for the prayer to continue and for speaking of like kingdoms, we have the kingdom of the enemy. That's like his kingdom over there. And for the kingdom of God to reclaim the land. And so that's been sort of a way that we've been praying as we go over there. And we saw massive differences. It was more lighthearted. There was more camaraderie. There was more laughter. It was just a sweetness in the interactions with people. And it wasn't all, roses and fluffy and fairies, but it was quite lovely, like a lot lighter than it was in the past. Okay, so on our way back, we left Kako, took off, and we usually have a choice. Are we going to go through Lake Clark Pass? Are we going to go through Merrill Pass? Or are we going to go through Rainy Pass? Those are the basic 3 passes to go back. So I was going to fly back with Jeff, the other pilot. We usually try to fly together as much as we can. We've flown a lot together, and we try to do that. So we had our families with us, and we talked about going through McGrath and then Rainy Pass. We have some friends in McGrath. We can stop, get a cup of coffee, say hello, and they keep going. But those friends were out of town at the time. And so we could go through Merrill Pass, which is probably the most time-saving route. But Merrill Pass often has more weather than the other passes. And even though it's the more direct route. But I suggested we go through Lake Clark Pass, which was a little bit longer. But I said, well, we could stop in Port Allsworth. I was there on our way up here. So Jeff and I agreed we're going to go to Port Allsworth. So we went in there and we just had a few hours there. The folks at Port Allsworth were so sweet. They fed us. They gave us coffee. We spent several hours talking, and they invited us to go back anytime we would like. Even for a little family getaway, they said they could probably spare a cabin or something, and we can go and get refreshed and rested anytime. And so they were so generous. It's just like a place you want to go back to because you're just refreshed by being there. And so I'm glad we went that way. Another stop in Port Allsworth. And then from there, we had a clear, nice ride back through Lake Clark Pass and back home to Big Lake. And that kind of concluded our family camp at Kako Retreat Center time. And then shortly after we got back, my dad and my brother came and visited. And I decided to take a week off and just spend time with them. And so it was really sweet. My dad paid for us to go on a glacier tour with the kids and my wife and my brother. And we did, I think it was called Phillips Glacier Quest Tour out of Whittier. And it was like a 4-hour tour. And so we drove to Whittier. There's a huge tunnel there. It's the second longest tunnel in America. And so, it was pretty cool driving through that and getting to Whittier. And in Whittier, we took this boat and it would go out, and we stopped at some waterfalls, and we stopped at 2 or 3 glaciers, and just got to, they kind of like turn off the engines, and they want to see if ice will break off into the water. And it's just cool to watch and listen to, but that didn't happen while we were there. But still, awesome trip. Highly recommend. Phillips, the company, did a great job. So then after that, I was able to, we rented a public use cabin. Alaska has these public use cabins that anyone can rent. They're like usually $100 a night, and they're in really neat places. So we went to Nancy Lakes. I think it was cabin number 3 on Nancy Lakes, and not too far from where I live in Big Lake. And so we went there for 2 nights, and we just fished. We caught a bunch of trout, and we cooked them up, had fresh trout, and had a sweet time at the cabin. The kids just loved it. My kids love going to cabins. So highly recommend Alaska public use cabins. It's something I have not taken advantage of much of, and I'm glad we did that. And then my brother really wanted to fly, so we got out the Maule, my Maule M5 235C that I have, and we flew, my dad and my brother and I flew over to Rohn. And Rohn is inside Rainy Pass, and there's a little airstrip there. And we flew in, and it was very, very windy, a very bumpy ride. And I had to do 2 passes in order to land there, because the first time I aborted because it was too windy and I was a little bit high. And so I aborted that landing, and I came around again, and the air smoothed out, and we were able to land there at Rohn. And at Rohn, there's this old historical cabin. Well, it's really not that old because it's been rebuilt, but there's been a cabin there for a long time. And we were able to go in the cabin, and this cabin's neat because it is a stop on the Iditarod race. So the racers will stop there to sleep and get rested or whatever. And so we went in the cabin and checked that out, and it's pretty well supplied. There's actually like aviation oil in there, and there's a cabinet full of food. There was even a bottle of vodka sitting in there. I was surprised. And a wood stove and a kitchen with propane. Kind of surprising amount of supply. And there was this logbook there for anyone who comes in and visits the cabin. You can write a little record. And so we wrote in our names, and we were here on this day. And that logbook has Iditarod racers listed in there. And so it was kind of fun reading those, and it goes all the way back to 1997 was the first log entry. So that was pretty awesome. And then while we were there, we did a little bit of fishing, or we tried to, but we didn't catch anything. But still a sweet experience at Rohn. The next day, I flew some friends out to Knik, some other friends that were visiting, but it was so windy, I didn't land anywhere. And so we flew back, but I think they had a good time. And then the next day after that, I flew my dad and my brother out to the Knik Glacier again. And the Knik is really popular because it's nearby Anchorage. And so a lot of people, the local general aviation pilots, like to go back there because it's close by. It's beautiful. There's a glacier back there, and there's a lot of airstrips. So with my dad and my brother, we flew up in there. And sometimes it's like a beehive in there because it's so popular. I like to call it a beehive, just planes everywhere. And you're talking on the radio trying to not hit each other. But we flew in there, and I landed at an airstrip in there called Picnic. And the locals will know what that is. And from Picnic, you can land and park your plane and get out and walk. And you get to this stunning, stunning view of the Knik Glacier. And ended up meeting a few people there that were there on tours. Just sweet time of enjoying Alaska's beauty. And then we flew home, and that was the end of our adventure. But so I think that's it. That's what I've been up to the last couple of weeks. So I hope that was at least somewhat interesting for you. And I'm hoping in the future to, as I go to Cochrane Hills, to talk about that, because that is next on the docket. Cochrane Hills Bible Camp is located in central Alaska, and it's on the Yukon River, very, very remote, and we will be there for about a month flying for that. So hopefully we'll have a lot to talk about when we get back. So we'll be in the bush for the next month, most likely not be able to get a podcast out. I'm not sure. There is a Starlink out there, so we'll see. But that was my Kako and a little bit of fun flying time here in Alaska. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. We'll see you next time.